Hello, everyone. Welcome to this Women in Ag webinar. First off, I'm Paul Geringer. I'm the Extension Legal Specialist in the Department of Ag and Resource Economics. I work with the Ag Law Education Initiative. And let me first off start by apologizing. I'm sorry I'm unable to do this live. So if you have questions, my contact info is at the end. And you can get in touch with me. I'm on a plane currently headed to Extension Risk Management Educators Conference in Cincinnati. So apologies, I did not look at my schedule when I agreed to do this at this time, so it's 100% on me. But thankfully, Shannon let me record this ahead of time so we could still get you the webinar. And I will move over. You can see the upcoming ones, Bugs That Bite on May 10th, and then Conflict Resolution and Ag Mediation on the 24th. So without further ado, we will flip over to the presentation. So today's webinar is sort of on preparing for the transition and farm transition and estate planning. The idea being that many of you probably have not started to think about this. This is something I'll throw out the figures here in a minute as to how many people have done it, but something that not many people have thought about doing and many need to consider doing. So I am an attorney. Nothing I say today is legal advice. I'm glad we're all good with that and it's on recording. So what do you need to be doing in this process? You know, many of you will probably think about this. Well, what do I need to be doing? It's something I've never really thought about doing. How do I go about getting the process started? And that's what we're going to talk about today is how do I get that process started? So the first thing you need to think about is where are you at? Where are you currently in the process? And as we go along talking about this today, I want you to think about where you're at in the process. Where have you gotten to in the process? We've been doing workshops around the state since about November discussing estate planning and farm succession. And that's the thought as to how to get you to where you need to go. So we need you to know where you're at as to how you want to get there, if that makes sense. So the first thing I need to point out to you is for many of you, you are right there. There is Earth in the Milky Way galaxy, so you're there. We at least know that much currently. I could get a little bit more pinpoint, but I could bring up a map of the region and show, well, we're maybe in one of these areas, but for the most part, we all know we're here. Where are we going to go from there? If I want to go over somewhere else, and if I can bring my little pointer up, if I want to go, you know, right there, I have to have a plan to get there. We're not just going to get there. We have to have a plan to get anywhere. And that's what this whole process is about, is how do we get you a plan to get there? My pointer, back to that. So today is all about getting you where you want to go. There is no similar method for anybody in this. Each one of these is going to be unique to your situation, to your family, to what everybody wants. So we need to think about what do we want in this process. This process, as we talk about it, this farm succession process, how do we pass the farm on to the next generation? And I should have defined that early on. Farm succession is just how do we move the farm from the current generation to the next generation, and how is that plan going to work? That plan is not always going to be the same for everybody. It's going to be different depending on family dynamics, what goals are for everybody, and how the family communicates together. This process is going to require a lot of communication with your family and other heirs. So if a grandchild's taking over the farm, you need to think about how am I going to get that farm to the grandkid? How do I set it up so if the grandkid doesn't want to farm in the end, he decides to get out, how do I set it up to where the grandkid doesn't get wealthy because he sold all the property? How do I make sure that property is distributed and the wealth from that property is distributed equally among the heirs? That's something you have to think about in this process. It's going to require you to think about a lot of different things that you may not want to think about at the end. If you're at the workshops, we're not going to talk a lot about this because it's not my area of expertise, but part of this may require developing a business plan for the farm. We may have to start looking at, okay, we've always been this type of operation. How do we bring in additional income to support another family on the farm? What are we going to have to do to make that work? And if you come to our workshops next fall and winter, we'll have Dale Johnson, or I think Shannon has done a couple of these too, as well, where we talk about business planning and what goes into that exactly. The other thing you have to think about is estate planning and what's that going to go into. And that's where I do a lot. And we'll talk about that next as we go along. We're not going to focus in a lot on business planning because it's not my strength, but it's something you have to think about as to how are you going to grow the business to bring in that other generation if it needs to be grown. You may already have that other generation working on the farm, so we may not need to develop as in-depth of a business plan as we would if it's starting from scratch. So the first thing we have to think about in this process are, what are your goals? And I'm not talking about soccer goals here, not talking about field goals in football. Please, I hope you're laughing as I scroll through these. But what we're talking about are, what are statements you hope to achieve in the future? And those goals that you set will change over time based on circumstances. Events will cause them to change, which requires you to go back and reevaluate and update. You may have a goal at one point that changes to something else down the road. Goals are always going to be unique. It's going to be unique to you and your family. We will not always know what each one of these goals are going to do. They're also going to reflect your values and your beliefs. So we need to think about this. What do you believe in? What are your values? What are your goals? No, not goals. We're setting these based on that. So pardon me. What are your values? What are your beliefs? And what do you and your family want? If one child does not have a goal to take over the farm, they're not the farm successor. They shouldn't be pegged for that. They may have a different role in the farm. You need to take into account your goals for your children may not match up with their goals for themselves. You're going to have to compromise between your family members. If you're listening to this, how many of you want to compromise with people? But you're going to have to in this process to make it a healthy process and a good family dynamic. So the thing we need to think about when we're doing this is we got to develop SMART goals. And it's not like Billy Madison, and I realize that my gifts do not work in this sometimes. You may not be, it's not that you're smart, it's an acronym for they need to be specific, measurable, action-oriented, reasonable, and timely. So we need to set something specific. So if the goal is to grow the business by so much percent, that's good. That's specific. If it's just to grow the business, how do we tell we've grown the business? We need it to be very specific. We need to put something in there that's measurable. We need to make it action-oriented. We're going to do something that's an action. We're going to grow the business by so much percent. It needs to be reasonable. If we say we're going to grow the farm by 50% in 1 year, that may not be reasonable based on current market prices. But if it's grow it by 10%, 5%, that may be reasonable. And is that goal timely to the farm? So is it timely? Does it make sense at this time to do? These are all things you're going to have to think about. So like I put here, an example, if your goal is to diversify the farm, to include agritourism to increase farm income by the fall of 2016, I apologize, I did not update that number to 2017. That may be doable. That's a very specific, you have a dollar amount, you know when you want to have it done. It's action oriented, you're going to increase income. These are all things you need to think about as you're setting this up. I often use, when I talk about goals, I use the Black Knight as well from Monty Python and the Holy Grail. Monty Python and the Holy Grail will come up here quite a few times. But if you think about it, if you've seen the movie, the Black Knight had a goal. That goal was no one should pass him. Now let's go back to this. Is it specific? It's specific. No one shall pass. Is it measurable? Yeah, you can measure that because no one shall pass means if someone passes, you've measured the goal wrongly and you failed. It's action oriented. Is it reasonable? Well, in that case, it wasn't. Is it timely? Probably timely, but is it reasonable? Well, in some cases, because he kept losing body parts and continuing to try to do it. In the end, once we get these goals set, we'll have a list of them. We need to prioritize them. Which ones are important? Which ones are less important? Which ones do we need to achieve first to achieve other goals? We have short-term goals that are going to lead to long-term goals. These are things you need to think about. And I realize I put what goals are important again because it's kind of important. What are the important goals you're focusing on? And how are we going to prioritize your goals to achieve your plan in the end? You didn't realize that a lot of this was going to be stuff you have to do prior to just walking in to develop the plan. There's a lot that goes into this that you may not be thinking about, but you need to think about prior to going in. And as we often tell people when they come to the workshops, the goal is to help you save money. We want you to have a lot of the groundwork done before you walk into the attorney's office, the accountant's office. Spend a lot of money. We want you to get it done ahead of time. These goals, when you implement them, are going to be the roadmap for how you, I say that wrong. You need to set a roadmap for how you're going to implement. Go back to my first picture where I showed you the galaxy. You need to think about how I'm going to get from point A to point B. How am I going to achieve that goal? What's the roadmap for implementing it? You're going to have to work with your family members, other stakeholders, your banker, other people that you utilize in the business to be able to do this. These are all things you need to think about as you're doing it. What are the potential problems to do this, to implement? You may not think about it. Talk to the family members, the stakeholders, see what they have to say. They may walk in with a clear picture as to what the problems are going to be than you would. Recognize that life is going to change at some point. You are going to have to reevaluate these goals. You know, something could happen to where the on-farm heir may not be able to take over the farm. How are your goals going to change when that happens? Take time to make sure your goals are being met, and if you need to reevaluate them. You know, going back to my original example of a specific goal, if you don't achieve the goal of raising farm revenue through agritourism by $20,000 by the next year, do you need to change that goal? Do you need to set it? What's the market specifics? Or do you need to do something different to achieve that goal? Do you need to do advertising to reach that goal? What specifically do you need to do to be able to hit that goal? Once you do that, and once you've kind of set the goals with the family members as to what they want to do at the farm, then you can start developing an estate plan. And I'm going to take a drink of water. So you're going to develop an estate plan. So the vast majority of farms do not have an estate plan or a transition plan. And I should go back here. By estate plan, I also mean transition plan. We're probably going to do both of these together. It's going to be the easiest way to do it and save us the most time. But when we start looking at this, we don't have real figures that talk about this. But the majority of farms, from what we can tell, do not have an estate plan or a transition plan. Nobody has really done a good analysis of this. So we need to review, what has recently been found about the American population. Well, annually groups will do surveys, and basically every year it comes out the same, and we get chastised for this, but 52% of Americans do not have some form of an estate plan. Most have not had conversations with elderly parents as to what's going to happen to them if they don't have an estate plan and what other issues are. And as we talk about this, the estate plan is going to be an all-encompassing document that's going to have a lot more in it than just a will. It's going to take care of you through health care, business dealings, a lot of stuff you need to think about. So why would you want to develop one? Well, if you have minor children for some reason, you may be a new parent, another parents with older children that are still under 18. You need to think about who's going to raise them. Do you want them being raised by a pack of wolves, or do you want them being raised by a specific family member? Who do you want taking care of those children? Who do you want to get things? Who are going to get certain family items, things like that? So we want to designate who the beneficiaries are. Who's going to make your business decisions if you get hurt and can't make them? Who's going to keep the farm going if you're the sole person making all the decisions? Who's going to make those decisions for you? You can set that with an estate plan. And same kind of thought, who's going to take care of your healthcare needs? Who's going to make those healthcare decisions for you if you can't do it? So you have to set powers of attorney for business and healthcare. And I need to point out, when you're looking at this, if you have multiple children, or siblings, it may not be, one person making this decision in both cases. It may not be the same person. There may be one person that's better at business decisions. That's probably who you're going to put in charge of your business stuff. If there's a kid that's better at healthcare decisions, that's the kid you're going to want to put in that kid. Other things you have to think about are, what do you want to happen to you if something bad happens to you? If you have to be put on life support or stuff like that, what do you want to have happen to you in some way? Okay, that's what the Advanced Healthcare Directive is. It's also called a living will. As a part of this, you're probably going to do a will. You may do a trust. Trusts are not for everybody. For the most part, we'll talk about them here in a minute as to when they may be come into play. Life insurance, we're going to potentially do it for some reasons to equalize benefits among children or grandchildren. The first thing I need to point out to you is, what happens if you die without an estate plan? Well, if you die without an estate plan, the state has a method for you. And you may like the state method, you may not like the state method. But if you die without a valid will, you have died in almost any state what is considered intestate. You do not have a will. And state laws govern how your property is distributed. And as I point out, intestate means you're just a person who dies without a will. I put Snoop Dogg up here because this is the Snoop Dogg method. About a year or so ago, Snoop Dogg came out and basically said, I don't have an estate plan. I just want to be reincarnated as a butterfly and let my children fight it out over who gets my estate and watch it. Okay, you can take that method, but that method creates potentially hard feelings. It potentially creates a lot of issues where family members may not get what they want. We haven't set any wishes. We don't know how anything should be done. So we've created a whole bunch of problems. Snoop Dogg's family. But the idea with intestate laws are basically that the idea is you like your family members and you want them to have your property. So for the most part, if you have a spouse and children, the spouse will get 50% of the property and the children will have the other 50% divided up amongst themselves. That may not be what you want. We don't know about your relationship with your children. We don't know if they've taken into account, how you feel about them or anything. You may not like them. You may not want them to have anything you own. So we need to take that into consideration. And the only way we can do that is through an estate plan. So who can create a will? I always love this quote from the Arkansas Supreme Court. Let it first be stated that one does not have to be a genius, a college graduate, a high school graduate, or even attended grade school to make a will. You don't have to be the smartest bulb in the box. You just have to be a person over 18 years old and of sound mind. Anytime under 18, if you're making this, it's not going to be good. So we have to start thinking about, okay, who can make these? Anyone over 18 that's of sound mind. This basically means you're able to figure out who has the stuff in your life that you're most concerned about. And a will, as we're going to talk about it, is just one estate planning tool that you're going to look at for the most part. And if you're wondering why I was pausing there, I had to move some stuff around so you could not hear the sound, hopefully, of the large drill going off in the background while I record this. Holographic wills are something we should talk about. For the most part, wills are going to have to be done in a way to where they're properly witnessed to make sure when they go to court, they're able to be proven as true. The reason for this is you're dead at that point and you can't tell us if this is legitimately what you want to do. So we go through these elaborate signing processes. Usually we have to have two people witness your signature and typically a notary witness all that and then notarize the document so it's valid in almost any state we have to take it to. Because as we talk about this later, if you have property in multiple states, so you're a person that lives near Delaware, Maryland, you have farmland, Maryland, Delaware, you're going to have your will proven in 2 states to be able to do this. Holographic wills are one way around this. So a holographic will is a will. So a holographic will is one that's written entirely in your own handwriting. You cannot type it. You have to handwrite it and sign it at the end. This is an example of a holographic will, actually from an Oklahoma case that I found online. They're only valid in Maryland, and I forgot to look up when they're valid in Delaware, but if anybody emails me, I can tell you real quickly. They're only valid in Maryland if it's signed by a member of the armed services, and they have to be signed by the tester outside the United States. They're void 1 year after discharge from military service. The idea is you're in the military, you're in armed conflict at this point, so you're contemplating your death, so we want to make this easy on you. A lot of states will recognize these as valid. A lot of southern states have had a history of recognizing these as valid. Maryland does not recognize them as valid, and we want people to go through the proper process to do this. The other thing to point out with wills is at any point, once you've sort of developed them as how property is going to be distributed, you can always change them. It's called drafting a codicil. It has to meet the same requirements as a will. So if we have to have two witnesses and a notary, we need two witnesses and a notary to the codicil. So what about things outside the will? So for the most part, wills are going to dictate how the property is distributed amongst your death. But we're going to have a lot of property that's going to go outside the will. So even if you say certain property is going to go inside the will, it may not, depending on what the conditions are. Life insurance policies will not be in the will. You already have selected a beneficiary. So the beneficiary will take the money outside the will. You don't have to do that. If you have a payable on death bank account, those go to who you have already selected. You cannot change that in your will. You have to go to the bank to do that. You have to go to the life insurance company to change the beneficiary. If you have a joint bank account with your spouse, the spouse automatically gets that bank account. If you have real property being held as joint tenants with rights of survivorship, whoever the survivor is automatically gets that property. Unlike wills, we're going to look at trusts. Trusts are an estate planning tool that's not for everybody. Who should consider using these trusts? Well, anyone with estate tax issues. For the most part, that's 5.49 million here in the U.S. We'll talk about Maryland, and again, I apologize. I have not been doing Delaware's in my presentation, so I'm unaware of what Delaware's is, but if you email me, I can tell you real quickly. It's probably higher than Maryland's, is my guess. If you have children or disabled family members that you're going to have to take care of when you pass away that still need upkeep, you may want to consider setting up a trust for those. And if we have family members who can no longer manage their own affairs, they may want to set up trusts to be able to manage property for them on your death. So I put this in here. I'm not going to talk about it. This is just some trust terminology. We have the trustor, the grantor, the settlor. These are the people that set up the trust. Trustee is a person who manages the property in the trust. And one thing I need to point out about this is if you have a trustee managing it for you, if it's not a family member, it's a bank, it's somebody like that, statutorily they can claim percentage each year as a management fee. So we may want to limit those, and that's something you can talk to attorneys about. A beneficiary is just the person that the trust benefits. So if you set up a trust for your children, they're the beneficiaries of the trust. You can create a trust in your will upon your death. It's called a testamentary trust. Example of that is typically we may do them for minor children. We may put the house and all the property in a trust for minor children or a disabled family member so it can be managed and utilized for their care over time. And we have some way to make sure our children are well taken care of. A living trust, these are something that's caught on recently. It's created during the trustor's life and continues after their death. It's used by many people to avoid the probate process. We're going to talk about probate here in a minute. I haven't gotten to that yet, but it can either be revocable, which means you retain control of the trust to change beneficiaries, trustees, and terms, and even choose to dissolve the trust over the course of your life. Once you die, it becomes irrevocable. Irrevocable is you have permanent and retain no power to change the trust. Upon your death, almost all revocable trusts, living trusts, become irrevocable. So why do we want to do these? It's typically a way to avoid probate costs, but probate, as we're going to talk about, may not be as bad as you think it is. It allows for the transfer of property in different states. So if you're back to my example, if somebody has property in Maryland and Delaware or Virginia as well, you may want to consider these just to make the ease of the estate planning process easier on you and avoid probate costs in 2 or 3 states. It also allows for the management of your assets if you become incapacitated. We can distribute property to beneficiaries faster than the probate process. Probate could typically take a year. This we can settle within a couple of months. Reasons not to consider a living trust. There can be expensive to set up depending on how you have to retitle property and a bunch of other things. You're going to have to use an attorney to draft these, so it will cost you a little bit of time and to potentially administer. For some people, these benefits can or expenses can outweigh the benefits. It just depends on what your situation is. Like I say, trusts are not always for everybody. They may seem like they're for everybody, but they may not always be. So, what are some of the developing an estate plan, the pros of a will, and cons of a will? And this is where we come down to this: is how are people going to look at this, and how are we going to utilize this? So with wills, we need to think about, okay, we control the property up until our death. That's a good thing. How many people have control issues, saying you're listening to this? If you have control issues, this may be something you want to think about. You can direct who gets property. You can change your mind periodically and change your will as much as you want to. So if you don't want a family member to get a piece of property, they don't have to get that piece of property. You can select the executor and the guardians. So the executor is going to be the person that takes your will and enforces it in court and works to make sure property is distributed amongst the ways you want it to be distributed. And then once that property is distributed, you no longer need it. So it may take, a year or so to distribute the property and work its way through the probate process, but it's not always. So with wills, the cons are most people do not like these because you have to probate them. And probate is this process where we take it to court and we prove it's the original document and it's true. It's actually your wishes. This is why we have to have this ceremony where we sign it in front of two witnesses and then we have a notary witness all this and then sign it, because we may have to probate this thing in multiple states. And probate is a very public process. And I say that because your will be entered into court, it becomes a public document. And some people do not like this process because it is a very public process and would like some privacy in their life, especially as they're thinking about how they're going to distribute property amongst their family members. These things can be easily contested. So if you cut a child out, it doesn't matter, or another family member, it may not be a child, they can still contest it. Even if there are these things in wills called no contest clauses. No contest clauses say basically if you contest this will and you lose, basically you don't get any money out of the thing. But we also have ways around this. We allow it, especially if we think this document is being used to defraud other family members. There are ways around these no contest clauses. As I said, it takes time and it's a very public process. People do not like this process because it's potentially a very public process. It's very state specific too. We're going to have to check. You may have and I'm from Oklahoma originally. Holographic wills are legal in Oklahoma, but if I own property in Maryland and I want to distribute that property, I can't use a holographic will. Well, then I have to fall under intestate process. So what's valid in the state I'm living in currently, no holographic wills, may trump another state, Oklahoma, where they have, or not trump, but we may have these differing viewpoints on wills. So we have to think about this as we're doing it and make sure that potentially this document conforms with every state law. We're going to have to do it. And that's one of the reasons why some states may not require the document to be notarized, but we may still do it just to make sure it meets the requirements in other states if you take property. Why would you want to develop get a living trust? What are the pros and the cons of that? Well, it eliminates the need for probate. You've now taken out the probate process. The document tells us how it's going to be distributed, and we can do it with no public info. We don't ever have to put this in. It's very difficult to contest. If you're not a member in the living trust, if you're not a beneficiary in any way to the living trust, you can't contest it. So you can effectively cut children out of these things. And this is one point when we go back to this as to why communication is key. If you want to cut a family member out, we have to tell that family member specifically why we're cutting them out. So if the goal is to cut one child out over another child, we need to make sure that's very clear in the document as to why that's being done. There's no need for a guardian to hold assets for minor children. We now have a trust that can hold that document, or family members who can't take care of themselves. We now have a trustee doing it for us, for the beneficiaries, the minor children or the children unable to take care of themselves. What are the cons? You potentially have trustee fees involved in this. I use my grandma a lot as an example when we do this work. So if I use my grandma, she has um, asked potentially down the road if I would be trustee of her living trust and manage it, and I've said no because basically I'm not stupid and I don't want to make my aunt, my three aunts and my mother mad at me by not doing something one of them wants. So in order to provide family unity, I have decided that in the end it's just going to be simple. If my grandma just hires a trustee to do this, this means a trustee will get paid money each year and have to do it. Yeah, it's a bad thing as a grandchild. I don't want to do this, but at the same time, it's not a good family dynamic to put myself into. It potentially adds complexity to asset management. Now, instead of just being able to sell something, it may be a part of the trust, and we have to look at what that issue is going to be to that, and just what does that level have to do. We still need to coordinate these with the other estate planning tools. We're still going to need living will, healthcare directives, and powers of attorney. You're still going to need a will. Typically, you'll just need a pour-over will that basically says anything not listed in this is, actually a part of the trust. So we have that as well. So you're still going to need a will of some sort with these. These are kind of the basic estate planning tools as we go to how do we move assets back and forth. And like I said, as we're looking at the farm succession plan, these are going to be a part of it. We're going to move on to other ways. We're going to do this here in a minute as well. Other parts of the estate plan that will go into this are we're going to appoint, a durable power of attorney. And these are basically who's going to be your agent who handles your business financial issues that arise when you become incapacitated. And that authority is basically going to last until it's either revoked by you or whatever event that caused it to spring into life takes it away. So if you become incapacitated and then gain capacity back, it goes away. Or your death. After death, no one can make decisions for you. We move into a different process where we're going through probate, and the executor of your will be making those decisions, or whoever the beneficiaries of the trust will start making those decisions for you. At the same time, we're going to need a healthcare proxy. A healthcare proxy is similar to a durable power of attorney. So durable power of attorney is going to be people making business decisions for you, making sure bills are paid on time. If you own livestock, they're going to be making sure livestock are marketed appropriately, grain is marketed appropriately, whatever the farm business is doing. And the thing I need to point out here is this durable power of attorney can be as broad or as limited as you want to make it. I've done them to where they're as broad as they can make any business decision for you to as minor as you can only make certain business decisions. Healthcare proxy. These things are going to be real simple as well. These are going to be the people making your healthcare decisions for you. So these are the people that if you go to the hospital and you become incapacitated, who's going to make decisions for you on surgery? They will not potentially be able to make decisions on end of life care. We'll talk about that here in a minute. They'll be able to look at your medical records, be able to help make medical decisions for you if you can't. I need to point that out. Yeah, if they're not limited, they may be able to make end-of-life decisions for you. You may want to be able to give that person that broad of authority, or you may want to do a living will to sort of more broadly express that. A living will, this is that advanced healthcare directive I talked about earlier. It's just a set of instructions given to a person in the event that they are no longer able to make their own health decisions. Typically, it specifies what treatments you want and what you do not. Do you want to be resuscitated if, for some reason they need to, resuscitate you because of a surgical procedure or whatever? Do you want to be put on life support? What are your wishes? So why do you want to do this? As I often tell people, these are the most depressing documents to do because they'll talk to you about every way you could potentially be hurt, and you have to make a decision off of it. Honestly, it takes the burden off your family. You've made the decision. They know what mom or dad wants. They don't have to think about it. You've already specified what you want. They may think you want X. You've now told them what that you want, and X may not be what you want in the end. Decisions made when you can't make decisions. You've already made the decision. Hopefully, you've thoughtfully thought about it and haven't just made a rash decision. You've taken the time to kind of go through this and think, oh, this is what I want. This is not what I want. Other issues to consider. How are we going to transfer farm data? One of the things that I've been working on with a former student of mine who is working with me till he goes to grad school. How do we handle all the data that's being produced on farm equipment now? So we have yield monitors, yield maps, all this stuff that's being done. How do we distribute that data upon your death? Simple things such as emails and other things like that, you may not be able to keep going after your death. They may actually go away because the terms of agreement may actually say that you are the sole owner, and upon your death, this account is supposed to go away. So how do we set this up in a way where data is being shared? The other reason why this may become important as well is you may have all these documents stored on the cloud. All your financial information may be on the cloud, or you may just do online banking, pay your credit card bills online. Every bill may be paid online. How are your heirs going to be able to make these decisions for you without knowing how to get it? So some of this is working to figure out how do we safeguard your information, but still allow family members to get access to it. The other thing to point out is if the farm is using social media accounts, we're going to want to make sure that somebody has access to those upon your death so they can continue doing it. That may be a part of the brand of the farm, that we need that ability. We don't want to lose those followers. We don't want to lose those likes. We have to keep the farm going. More than likely, you may not want to be the person in charge of that, so it may be another family member, but that family member needs to be thinking about, how do we maintain this if I pass away or something happens to me? Okay, so now as we've been talking about this process, we're down to the tax considerations. And I take another drink of water. It's a long time I've talked without taking a drink of water. So before we get started, I need to point this out. I am not a tax expert. If you thought my disclaimer at the start was bad, I am not a tax expert and I do not pretend to be one. If you have detailed tax questions, please talk to an accountant, not me. We're all good with that, right? So we need to talk about federal estate taxes. In about 2010, these things were set to be pegged to inflation, and they go up each, which basically means as long as inflation goes up, they go up. In 2017, this year, it's 5.49 million. Sometime around September, they'll release the numbers for 2018. And with a couple, we double that. So it becomes a little close to $11 million at that point for a couple. And the reason is you can pass on property to your surviving spouse without any estate tax burden. And there's this idea of portability to where your surviving spouse can use your estate tax exemption to benefit them upon their death. And this is called portability. Portability basically, as I said, allows the surviving spouse to use the unused federal estate tax exemption from the predeceasing spouse. There's one caveat to this. You have to file the appropriate tax forms. For the most part, accountants and attorneys have gotten really good at this, and you cannot get remarried. If you get remarried, you're no longer the surviving spouse. You're a spouse. So if there's a lot of estate planning deals that may go into this, especially if you're the surviving spouse who cannot live alone and needs to get remarried and falls in love, there may be issues with that you need to talk to the attorney about. In Maryland, as I said, we've recoupled with the state estate tax exemption, or the federal estate tax exemption that started in 2015 and will increase by 2019, will potentially be fully recoupled. That may change depending on how Congress handles the federal estate tax. There's been calls to eliminate it. We don't know where that's going to go at this point, but for this year in Maryland, at least, it's $3 million, and it's $4 million starting next year, and in 2019, it will be repegged with the federal estate tax limit, which means it will probably be close to $6 million. And I am looking real quickly to see if I can find what the federal estate tax exemption is in Delaware. And I can point it that out to you, but I will go back to my presentation as we go along, and as it comes up, I will do it. Maryland does have a special estate tax exemption for agricultural property. It exempts $5 million of ag property as long as you agree to keep it in ag value for 10 years. There's one issue with this. The one issue is that potentially, as we move forward, people may not bring this property in because it's actually going to be lower than the current estate tax exemption for non-ag property. And the reason this was created by the General Assembly is because at one point, as most people in Maryland know, the estate tax exemption for most of the 2000s has been $1 million or lower at some times. So part of the problem has been getting that estate tax exemption. Double checking. Oh, good. So Delaware matches the federal estate tax. So whatever the federal estate tax is, you do it as well. So it will continually be pegged to inflation in Delaware. So Delaware, you're on better track than us. See, I told you it was going to be better, and I didn't even know. The gift tax exemption for 2016-2017 is basically $14,000. This is also pegged to inflation, but it only goes up to the next $1,000. So it's been $14,000 for a few years. It will not go up to $15,000 until inflation gets it up to where we can gets it to $15,000. Portion used for gift counts against the federal estate tax exemption, so it goes down. So we have to pay attention to this. There are strategies involved, which is why you should talk to an accountant. What are the other issues that are going to come up? This is where we're going to get into farm succession a lot. Some of the issues that come up in this process are how do we handle that farm kid versus city kid in issue. We have one kid that stayed on the farm, working on the farm, probably taking a lower salary, continuing to work for mom and dad, potentially helping to grow the farm. So is it fair to give that kid the whole farm? Well, if the farm is the whole estate, what's the other kid going to get? How do we equalize that? We always need to point out equal does not always equal equitable. I use my grandma as an example. My grandparents own 4 farms, 5 farms, yeah, something like that. But they have 4 daughters. Each daughter will get a farm, about 160 acres, and they'll share it another farm. The problem with this is one farm is where their house is at, and one farm is where their rent house is on. So when my grandpa passed away and they did the accounting, one aunt was going to get 50%, over 50% of the estate, and the others were kind of going to get that much. So how do we equalize that out? They luckily agreed to a way to equalize it out that makes it a little more fair. But the problem is, what happens, if that's not the case? How do we set this up? This is where life insurance may come into play. This is where we may have some strategies that come into play to where we can equalize payments. And we'll talk about some other things we can do on the next slide. Some other ways we could do it is we may have to look at business entities. So one strategy may be we set it up to where ownership of the farm resides in an entity controlled by all the heirs. But the majority control is given to that farm's successor. They may control all the voting rights and how that farm is handled. And there's some participation rights to where the off-farm heirs can get some money out of it, but not a lot. There may be other ways we set it up to where the farm business resides with the on-farm heir, and all the property is controlled by the off-farm heirs, and the property is tied up in long-term leases and other strategies to make sure that the farmland is able to be controlled by the on-farm heir to be able to continue to use it. There's strategies there as well. So these business entities can be used to equalize this as well. As again, I pointed out earlier, what happens if the on-farm successor is the one grandson and you have 3 children? How do you make sure that that one grandchild does not walk away with a fortune if they decide to get out of farming shortly after your death? Well, you may want to set it up where, there's a business entity that controls everything. That grandchild makes all the decisions. He controls a majority of the shares that make decisions or membership interest, depending on what we use. but the other heirs are members or shareholders of that business. I use shareholders and members because if we're talking about corporation, it's shareholders. LLC, it's members, but the idea is sort of the same. We could divide that interest up to where everybody still maintains something. We may want to look at conservation easements. I'll show a site here at the end where we have publication on that. Conservation easements may help equalize some of that payment between it, and it can also, you know, it brings cash in when we may not have cash available on the farm. Another thing to talk about with this is we're thinking about this is why we want to not institutionalize this, but make this more formal is what about sweat equity? As I said, Monty Python comes to play a lot in this. Sweat equity is, if you've seen Monty Python in the Holy Grail, there's a scene where the king points out, or the king points out and goes, son, someday all this will be yours. That's sweat equity. We just said it's all going to be yours. The kid may go out and work on the farm every day, but have no formalized process that they're actually going to take the farm over. There's documents out there, and I need to put them up on our website as well, as to how do you value this sweat equity if we haven't formalized a process. It's very hard to do. But the idea is we need to formalize this relationship. This is why we're thinking about sweat equity, because sweat equity is not enforceable. We want to create something enforceable so that on-farm heir gets something in the end for what they've done. So what do we do about marriage and divorce? So what happens if an heir gets married during the implementation of this plan? We need to remember what the great thinker Kanye West said. None of you thought I was going to quote Kanye and Snoop Dogg in this, did you? Kanye West told us, holler, we want prenup, we want prenup. You have to start thinking about prenups. Why? Because we want to make sure that the spouse who marries into the family does not have a claim to the farm business and divorce. One thing I need to point out here is if you're gifting this over time to the on-farm heir, as long as you keep it as a gift to just that child and not the child and the spouse, that gift remains with the child, doesn't become marital property. So we may have to think about that. A prenup will just back that up if we have to do it. And we are slowly getting to the end of this, if you want to know. What are the other reasons we want to talk about prenups? We may have complex families where we have, parents, one mother, one father get married later in life after they've had children. Either the first spouse passed away or there was a divorce in the family. We don't know. There's adult children and there's no plan to have additional children. One example would be the Brady Bunch. But we want to ensure that basically each spouse's assets go to their children. So if we don't do this, if Mike Brady, passes away after Carol and doesn't like any of the three girls, he could be able to dictate how their mother's property goes to them. And that's not something we want. That being said, too, if we're looking at a farm business, we don't want the spouse that's just come on being able to have a control of a farm that may already have an on-farm heir. We want to limit that. The other reason we want to do this potentially is in most states we allow the spouse to elect outside the will if they do not like the share they were given in the will. It's usually 50% of the will, and then everything else is divided up. This is one way to take away that spousal election, to say you can no longer do this. So what are you to do? You've now thought about this process. You're thinking about, okay, how do I equalize stuff? How do I make it more fair? You have to work with a team. You have to assemble professionals like the Avengers, but they're your individual Avengers. You're probably going to need an accountant, tax professional, attorney. You may need to talk to your banker. You'll figure out who to bring into this as you need them. One thing I need to point out here is when we start doing this, unless your attorney is a CPA for some reason, attorneys make horrible tax accountants and tax preparers, and accountants make horrible attorneys, and we all like to think we're good at the other one's profession. So take that into account when you're doing this, and make sure you're working with an attorney and an accountant together, and not just relying on the information of one, unless that attorney potentially has a CPA background. Once you've got this and you've developed the plan and you know what you're going to do and you've talked to your heirs, you need to start thinking about, okay, how are we going to implement this? It's like your goals. You're going to have to implement, evaluate, and revise. So why would you want to consider revising? Well, when you think about the big things that happen in life: birth, death, marriage, divorce, and disability. You know, if you get divorced, you got to think about, how do I change all these documents to make sure the spouse, my former spouse, is no longer listed on everything. Do we make something big purchase in the farm? Did we get rid of something big in the farm? Has there been a major legal change? I have an example on that in a minute. Is there a regular basis we need to be changing this? When we think about major legal changes, estate taxes is a big one. They may change it or it may go up. If we look at Maryland's, a lot of the Maryland estate plans have been set up because there was a $1 million exemption. There were a lot of ways around that people were utilizing and created complex documents. That may be able to be done away with now. So we may have to start looking at, okay, how do we revise this to get it in line with that? The other thing about is, what happens if an unfortunate thing happens and the on-farm successor passes away? What if the on-farm successor no longer wants to farm? How do we go about changing the plan once that happens? What's the method? Who's going to take it over? Are we going to have to liquidate the farm at this point? Or are we going to hire a manager to manage it, and then family members will continue to run it, but there'll be a manager out there, telling them the decisions that need to be made, what needs to be done? What do we do? These are things you have to think about. So as we wrap this up and we start thinking about this, the Family Business Institution has found, because as we look at this, we're looking at basically family businesses. And everyone has this dream that the family business is going to continue on to the next generation. They found basically in a survey, 88% of current family owners believe the same family will be controlling the business 5 years down the road. But what do the facts tell us? In the same survey, they found 30% of all these family businesses survived to generation number 2. Those of you that don't know, I'm using the TV show Dallas as my example. That was jockeying on the first slide, Bobby and JR. Third generation. We come to the third generation of the new version of Dallas that was canceled like after 3 seasons. 12% survived to that third generation. Since the TV show has ended again, we don't know how that fourth generation will look like. 3% survived to the fourth generation. The goal is to keep the farm going, and you want it to have better odds than the second generation taking it over. This is the fourth generation taking over fifth generation. We need to set up a succession plan and make sure we're getting the people trained that need to be trained to take over the farm. So why do businesses fail among generations? So again, the goal is to keep the farm going. There's failure to prepare the next generation or incompetent successors. We have a succession plan. We know how this is going to work. We're bringing them in the business. This is one way we'll get around this. There's no clear succession plan. Well, if you're doing this, there is a clear succession plan now. We're taking care of family rivalries because we're figuring out how to deal with them before they become a problem. And I don't know why every number is number 1 on this. It was not that way when I uploaded it. So apparently there's a problem with my set of slides. There's insufficient capitalization in the business. If we do this right, we may be able to set this precedent where there is sufficient capitalization in the business. So kind of to wrap this up, hopefully this has not frightened you. It's a very depressing topic to talk about at 12 o'clock on a Wednesday afternoon, I know. But it's not to scare you, it's to get you prepared. You need to start thinking about this. It's something we all have to think about. We're going to start talking to the stakeholders, the heirs, whoever we need to be talking to, bringing into business, and the other qualified professionals who are going to help us do this plan. We've kind of talked about all the facets of this plan, but the goal is to get you to start walking in and thinking about this process. So to help you with that, we do have a page on the University of Maryland Extension page. It's extension.umd.edu/agtransitions. We have a lot of the resources. So we have fact sheet up on family farm estate planning, conservation easements, and a few other documents up there that you may want to. We're updating some of them. Some of them have been out of date since the 1990s, and I'm trying to get some of them updated with the same student who's working for me. So hopefully we'll have those out later this year. Through University of Minnesota Center for Farm Financial Management, there's this Ag Transitions website, and basically this is a site where you can upload your personal information. It is protected, and then share it amongst your professionals and the stakeholders that are coming into the business. So we can see it a lot better as to what we need to be doing. I use this site a lot. They have a very good resource on kind of walking you through the whole this book here, the transition farm transition workbook, through Oklahoma State University Extension to their Ag Econ department. It's really good. It's a really useful page. I use it a lot. The book is really good. It's about 100 and some odd pages long. I would not print it out. Look at it online if you have the ability to. This one's not free. All the other ones I talked about are free, and every time I do this, I never get the number updated. The book is about $25 to $45. It's on that website. You can buy a copy of it. Neil updates it each year. Dr. Neil Harrell is at Iowa State. He's kind of the dean of all this, especially farm estate and business planning, especially the tax issues. They do a bill every 2 weeks through there that's, I think, like $100 a year. That kind of gives you a tax law update as well. So it's probably not for most of you, but attorneys may be interested in it as well. But this book is really good. There's a lot of attorneys that force their clients to sit down and read this book before they can even talk to them. I have a couple of copies of it, and I am willing to loan them to you. I'm not willing to give them to you. So thank you. I do again apologize for not being here to answer questions. But if you're on Twitter, you can tweet me, or you can email me. I'm at conference the rest of the week, but I will answer it. If you call that number, you can leave me a voicemail. I will hopefully get back to you next week when I'm back in the office. But thank you all again for listening, and enjoy the rest of your day. And I shockingly almost did an hour of this.